Welcome to the Spectre of Communism. What the hell is postmodernism, and why do we, as communists, reject it?
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communists.
The communists.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
So you might have heard the term postmodernism bandied about by right-wing commentators and shock-jocks like Jordan Peterson, sometimes together with Marxism. Actually, these ideas are completely contradictory, and we're going to explain why. I'm going to introduce our speaker today. He is a member of the International Secretariat of the Revolutionary Communist International, and he's a regular on the show, also the host of our sister podcast, Against the Stream, Hamid Alizadeh. Hamid, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, Joe.
So, postmodernism is a bit of a slippery term, but the closest to a straightforward definition from a postmodernist philosopher is from a book called The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge by Jean-François Lyotard. This is actually from the introduction, and Lyotard writes, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as an incredulity towards metanarratives. This incredulity is undoubtedly a product of progress in the sciences, but that progress in turn presupposes it. To the obsolescence of the metanarrative apparatus of legitimation corresponds, most notably, the crisis of metaphysical philosophy and the university institution which in the past relied on it. So I'm going to offer an apology up front. There'll be a lot of word salad in the course of this podcast. And there's actually a reason for that. There's a philosophical underpinning to that, which we'll get into. But Hamid, could you try and unpick that for our viewers and listeners? What is Lyotard talking about when he says that the postmodern is an incredulity towards meta-narratives?
Well, first of all, I think we should just dwell on the language for a moment there, because I think a lot of young men and women enter university and they're fed with this material or similar, because Lyotard, for instance, is not really in vogue anymore, but there are other people who sound just like him and who say the same thing, basically. And they read this stuff and they think to themselves, I must be really, really stupid for not understanding this. And what we're here to tell them is that they are not the stupid ones. It's the people who wrote this who are stupid. And what is behind, there's an attempt to give an impression that these are very, very complex ideas that you cannot possibly understand unless you're on the same wavelength as these people who write it. In reality, what they are saying is very, very simple and can be reduced to extremely simple terms. Incredulity towards meta-narratives. What does that mean? Incredulity just means skepticism. It's a very, very deep form of skepticism. I'd never heard of that word before I read it here, but looking it up, that's what it means. Mm-hmm. And a meta-narrative, what that basically covers is a theory. That's what it is. These people are skeptical towards theory. That is the long and short of it, but you can't really just write that. you could have written suspicious of big ideas. That would have been
a suspicion towards big ideas is the simple version, the Wikipedia simple English version of that statement.
Exactly. Now, what they basically say is, yes, they reject theory, they reject science, and they do that on the account that theory and science is inherently oppressive. In other words, it is not the conditions of humanity that creates oppression of any sort, but it's the interpretation that we put on it that creates oppression. You have one of the main, archbishops of postmodernism, Foucault, mm-hmm. who talks about power, this amorphous being that oppresses us. But when you look at what does he mean by power? He basically means science, theories, psychiatry, medicine, the educational system.
It means knowledge as well.
Knowledge
in general.
Exactly. And we can get into that. Obviously, he picks out very reactionary parts of the history of psychiatry, for example, and medicine. And then he makes that, he raises it and says, look, you guys talked about, they told us that science was supposed to be progressive, it was to advance humanity, it's supposed to cause a better life. But here you see there's a lot of criminal stuff going on, and this is also science, and therefore science is neither good or bad. In fact, it's oppressive.
Mm-hmm.
And even more, when they talk about the oppression in society today, they talk about women's oppression. Women's oppression is not caused by social conditions, according to these ideas, but because of the idea that the woman is inferior, right? Racism or colonialism is not caused by inherent social forces that we can go into, but because there's an idea that says that there are superior and inferior races. But obviously, we know that's not the case. I mean, anyway, we can get into that. But basically, that is what it is. It's a renunciation of all theory, rejection of science, rejection of rational thought, and rejection of, what is there then instead of metanarratives, general theories, is local mini-narratives, which is anyone's theory, anyone's ideas.
Anyone's perspective.
Anyone's perspective is equal, actually better than the general perspective. There's no lawfulness in nature. There's no lawfulness in society. There's no lawfulness in history. It's just, everything is just a random series of events, and we are the ones who impose our interpretation on it. And by doing that, we define it. We define the world we live in through our interpretations. And most importantly, there's no objectivity. Objective truth doesn't exist outside. What is objective truth? Objective truth is things that happen without, whether we think about them or not, whether we are aware of them or not. That's objectivity. They deny that and essentially reduce everything to the subjective. And there are many different ways they do this, but I think that's how I would describe postmodernism at its core.
Yeah, and I'm glad you alluded already to identity politics and queer theory and post-colonialism, because postmodernism is a very broad and elastic school of ideas. They often don't call themselves postmodern, but there are offshoots. And while some of these thinkers we're going to deal with might not be in the vogue at the moment, you might not have even heard of their names, you might not have read any of their work, they've had an effect on the world around us. They have an effect on the class struggle. They have an effect on the labor movement, a negative and reactionary one. So this isn't just us criticizing these ideas, on the face of it, just presenting our objections to these particular thinkers. We're saying that there's a direct link between the ideas they present and some genuinely negative outcomes in the class struggle. But we'll get into that in more detail later on. The other thing we should say as well, there's a lot of charlatanry in the postmodern academy. Lots of people who pretty openly say they just write stuff in order to get published and make money, and they sit in their little ivory towers and they just want to think the great thoughts, and they have a kind of incredulity towards the wider world because they don't live in it, because they live in their little isolated university bubbles. So again, it's reiterating what Hamid said earlier, don't feel stupid if you don't understand this, because sometimes I really think they just write it to write things. I wanted to pick up on something though. This idea of Lyotard's, that he's opposed to, or he's incredulous towards, all meta-narratives. He basically writes off all grand theories. Isn't saying that in of itself a grand theory? If you say you're opposed to all grand theories, that's a statement which is really a grand theory. If you say they're all wrong, then that's quite a big statement.
Yeah, in the history of philosophy, there's always been a proud tradition amongst the greatest philosophers, whether they have, regardless of how right or wrong they've been. Some of them have made some big mistakes. But there's been a tradition in philosophy of attempting to have a coherent philosophy. But in postmodernism, you raise incoherence to a principle, which goes to make it completely absurd. As you say, they make a grand theory that no other grand theory is correct. That's basically what they say. No one else is right except us, and because we say so, not because we don't attempt to prove it. We're the only ones who are right, because we say that everyone else is wrong. You know, they talk about this idea that everything is subjective, and we can't possibly talk about universal patterns, lawfulness, anything that unifies different parts of the world, any recurring patterns. But surely that would also mean that we can't really expect anyone to really understand each other, right? If everything is subjective, if there's no recurring patterns, then how do we even understand each other? How do we pass on? How would we communicate things? Because surely what you're experiencing is different than what I'm experiencing, and both perspectives are equally true. So we're basically locked into our own little worlds. We have no communication with each other. And then that goes to show, why then are you writing these books? First of all, you weren't supposed to write any metanarratives. That's oppressive, but you do that anyway. But then why do you do it if you can't really make sure, if you can't really secure or guarantee that it's understood or accepted on the other side? And what if the other side has a meta-narrative as their narrative? Why is that then wrong? It just doesn't really make sense.
And I want to come back to this question of language. Something else that is worth saying, quite a lot of people in the postmodern tradition, they came out of fields of linguistics, of semiotics, people like Roland Barthes in the 50s and Derrida in the 60s. And because that was their field, the study of language and the study of signs and symbology, they sort of extended that to actually a grand narrative, actually a meta-narrative of how all of society and truth works. But there's a couple of dimensions to this issue of language, which we'll deal with in a few different ways. But the impossibility of understanding these people, like the completely baffling way they write, some of them say that that's a matter of principle. And I have an example. Judith Butler is kind of the main figure in queer theory. Queer theory is an offshoot of postmodernism, has a very subjectivist position, arguing that all gender and sexual characteristics are basically performances, that we just perform them. We learn them, we perform them, and we could just perform differently if we wanted. That's the crux of it. And she wrote a book called Gender Trouble in 1990, which is sort of seen as the foundational text of queer theory. And she wrote a preface to a new edition in 1999, which responded to criticism that her writing was completely impenetrable. And she says the following: "Neither grammar nor style are politically neutral. Learning the rules that govern intelligible speech is an inculcation into normalized language, where the price of not conforming is the loss of intelligibility itself. Formulations that twist grammar, although implicitly call into question the subject-verb requirements of propositional sense, are clearly irritating for some, no question. They produce more work for their readers, and sometimes their readers are offended by such demands. Are those who are offended making a legitimate request for plain speaking, or does their complaint emerge from a consumer expectation of intellectual life?" Basically what she's saying is, I'm impossible to read on purpose because that's a radical act. By refusing to submit to your oppressive norms of grammar and sentence structure, I am resisting your meta-narrative. I'm resisting this oppressive system. I mean,
I'm surprised you could understand that, because you weren't supposed to.
yeah, exactly. So there we are. I'm oppressing myself by insisting on understanding this. I mean, what do we make of this? What can you say about this?
Well, I don't know, really. I have to say. I mean, the point to make, there is a question of language. Does language change things? But the point to make about Judith Butler is that she has changed absolutely nothing. Her ideas have changed absolutely nothing. And I think this is kind of raising her own. The problem is she presents these, she overcomplicates her ideas in order to sell them, and then she's just justifying them. As you said, there's an industry of just throwing out this kind of verbal diarrhea. And that's what she's justifying there.
Yeah, and it's a point that's picked up by Foucault, by Michel Foucault, who you mentioned earlier, who is, I think, probably the most famous and, for lack of a better word, important postmodernist. He was a French philosopher, wrote a lot of his work between the 60s and 80s, and he, as you say, had this theory which centers on power, which he talks about in terms of the control of knowledge, but he also talks a lot about language, talks about the way that the powers that be construct our understanding of what's good, what's bad, what's sane, what's insane, in terms of the way we get to talk about it. So, for example, he writes in one of his texts about the way that, as he puts it, human beings are made subjects. So basically the way that people are oppressed, right? He says that he's developing a mode of inquiry which looks into the objectivizing of the subject, the speaking subject, in grammaire générale, so general grammar, philology, and linguistics. He says the subject is either divided inside himself or divided from others. The process objectivize him. Examples are the mad and the sane, the sick and the healthy, the criminals and the good boys. So basically, what he's suggesting is that the way that power, which he defines very, very, very generally and broadly, works on people is someone somewhere chooses what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, what's true and false, creates language around it, systems of language around it that he calls epistemes, and then we learn those, and that turns us into subjects. It turns us into slaves. It turns us into oppressed beings, subject to somebody else's language and systems of power. And the logic that flows from that is the way that we resist is to just talk about things differently, to talk about and think about things differently, to break away from these systems of control through language. So is that true? Do we change things by changing language? If we talk about things differently, does that change the thing?
Yeah, this flows from the original kind of premise of postmodernism, that it is not the objective world and objective human relations that are oppressive, but it is the way that we interpret them. And so for Foucault, power, it's difficult to know what he actually means about power. I don't even think he knows what he means about power. And as far as I understand, he put forward a new theory every book he wrote, and there was no he proudly proclaimed that there was no consistency in his theory.
Yeah, he wrote entire histories where he said he was doing an archaeological method, where rather than actually looking at sources, he just think about a thing enough and dig into it in his mind, and that will pull out the truth. So every book was a different theory.
Didn't dig very far though. But the point is, you don't look at the real relations in society. Now, it is true that obviously a lot of the, a lot of the ills of class society and oppression and so on is reflected in language, is reflected in the way that we talk about things. But it is wrong to say that changing that language will actually change anything. That's the thing we see, with political correctness. There's a hyper focus on political correctness. Oh, we can't possibly say this because that's disrespectful. Okay, well, no, we don't want to be disrespectful to anyone. There's no need for that. But this hyper focus to strike down on any wrong words used or misused, instead of focusing on what is actually going on, is actually diverting the attention. And it doesn't really change anything. It creates the illusion that you change something, but it doesn't really change anything. Now, for example, we talked about this before. You have to, we're not in any way in favor of misogynistic or racist language. Let's just put it there. Of course, we oppose that. But changing that language and talking about it differently doesn't change anything in relation to racism or misogyny. Where does women's oppression come from? Women's oppression did not come from some people starting to talk in a condescending way about women. It started from the early rise of class society,
Hmm.
which through a peculiar, course of development relegated women to a oppressed class. You can say it was the first class. In a way, women were the first class. That relationship was then compounded and emphasized throughout all of class society, throughout the history of class society. All of the propertied classes perpetuated that. And it's become a deep-seated prejudice in all of society, promoted by all of the ruling classes, right? And they use that division, the division between men and women, working class men and women in particular, is used politically as a way to divert the struggle against women's oppression, but it's also divert the class struggle as a whole against the ruling class, right? And there's a whole history behind that. And it's the understanding of that history that leads us to understand that it's only by changing the underlying structures which keep that oppression intact, which is what? Which is class society. By overthrowing class society, we can begin to free humanity from the shackles of women's oppression. You can change your words as much as we want. And yes, we're always in favor of the highest form of equality and the highest form of respect in language between all human beings. Of course, it would be stupid to deny to oppose that. But this idea that you can change reality and you can and this hyper focus on the political correctness, it actually distorts that struggle and it diverts attention away from that struggle. And it becomes a struggle between men and women, between ordinary people, between the oppressed, about which language to use, who is the most oppressed, and in the meantime, who remains safely in power? It's the rulers themselves. And there's also this idea that we can, as individuals, we can cleanse ourselves from the ills and wounds of capitalism, right? Once we cleanse ourselves, once we become these whole humans raised up above all of the ills of class society, then we can begin to change the world. Because if God forbid, we go into changing the world with prejudices that this class society has given us, but that's not how it works. We can the way to get rid of those prejudices is precisely to change the world we live in, to change the conditions that create this dead weight of tradition. Once we change those conditions, then the traditions can be washed away. And also, I would say this: all experience shows that it's in real life action that men as in mankind, human beings, men and women, change. A few years ago, I was, actually many years ago, I was visiting in Denmark. I was visiting there was an exhibition in a museum reminiscing or a strike of some women workers. They were they painted this porcelain. Is a very fancy Danish porcelain factory, and the Royal Porcelain something, and they were the painters of that. Okay. In the 70s, and they realized, the women there who were doing all these incredibly beautiful paintings, they realized that they were paid much less than the women.
The men.
The men. They went on a massive strike, 6-week strike, which is it's an incredible thing. And they would organize marches, they would organize solidarity collections. Then they would draw their paintings on their kind of drawings on these paper plates that they would sell all over Denmark in the tens of thousands to collect money for this strike. They would get solidarity from all over the country. And what was their demand? Equal pay, right? And they brought out the men as well, right? The bosses were clearly trying to divide here the men and women. The men were paid a little bit more, so the bosses were trying to create a situation where they believed that they had opposing interests to the women workers. But actually, through this mass action and through bringing in the men and unifying in this action, they actually won. It's a huge strike. It's a huge victory for these women. And I was talking to them. I went there with one of the comrades back then. We interviewed them. And what was interesting, we said, so what was the thing that you got out of it the most? And she said, the biggest achievement was that we changed. Through that struggle, They learned that they were equal. And not only they changed, but also the men changed. And these struggles formed a very fundamental role in changing the gender roles in Danish society, in the Danish working class. Of course, there's still women's oppression because we still have capitalism, and the conditions that create that kind of oppression has not disappeared. But that shows you what actually changes the relationship between people and the words that they use.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the inverse of that famous Shakespeare quote. You could say that an injustice by any name would smell just as rotten. Like, you can call it whatever you like, but unless you actually engage in a struggle to change the world and to change your own position in the world, then your mind is going to be constrained by a society that has need of these reactionary ideologies. The ruling class uses these ideas. They're very useful, and they're deeply ingrained, as you were saying. Okay, well, I'd like to talk about another important postmodernist, Jacques Derrida, who has a concept which very superficially sounds a little bit similar to what we might call dialectics. And in fact, he puts it in contradiction. He puts it in contrast with Hegelian dialectics, which he says is wrong. It's this concept of difference, not difference with an A, difference, sorry, not difference with an E, difference with an A. And he's like 4 paragraphs in his famous essay where he talks about the A. The long and short is he thinks that language, starting point, but also everything else as a consequence is made up of binaries, like binary systems, binary oppositions. So man, woman, good, bad, like we've been saying. And he says that these binaries are inherently oppressive because always one is lesser. Always one is subject to the other. So women are subjugated by men, black is subjugated by whites, so on and so on. You get the idea. And what he is trying to draw out, he says, is the difference, is the unique identity of the thing that exists constrained by those binaries. So he compares his system with Hegelian dialectics, and he writes, I'll quote directly, contrary to the metaphysical, dialectical, and Hegelian interpretation of the economic movement of difference, we must admit a game where whoever loses wins and where one wins and loses each time. I can't really interpret that usefully, but basically what I think he's getting at is, in his view, someone is always losing as a consequence of these binary oppositions. And what we need to do is deconstruct them. What we need to do is pull apart these binaries and free the unique particular thing, which sounds like an attack on or a rejection of what we would describe as the philosophy of identity, the relationship between the particular and the general. And you've talked about this in some depth. We had a podcast last season where we talked about the importance of theory, where you dealt with the question of the relationship between the individual and the general, the particular and the general. But why is it that postmodernists seem to object to this philosophy of identity?
Well, I mean, just this question of difference, what Derrida, as far as I understand, I mean, again, this is one of the reasons why they obscure things, because then they're slippery and they're hard to pin down. They can always say, oh, that's not what I meant because I put all these caveats in and this language is very, is binary or non-binary.
If any Derrida fans in the comments think that I got that wrong, then by all means,
it's very fuzzy. Anyway, but the idea is, look, they say meaning is deferred, right? There's no meaning in our language. If you look in a dictionary, every word is explained by other words. And then you look up those words and they're explained by other words, and so on and so forth. And you can go, there's an infinite regress, and you never get to the actual meaning of the true meaning of the word. So there's no meaning, basically. The words are not tied to anything. And that sounds radical, but it's a very one-sided way of looking at things. It reduces language to a subjective, self-contained, and isolated thing. And it's a very crude division between the subjective and the objective. Because when we say man and woman, there's not just a language binary. That's the real binary. Because the majority part of the animal kingdom consists of males and females. There's no better or worse. They're both equally necessary for the procreation
We're going
of
to
species.
get some pedants in the comments saying, "Oh, what about protozoa and what about microbes, which are the
I
majority?"
said the majority. I didn't say. I didn't say. At least the majority of multicellular
There we go. There we go.
animals. Let's put it like that. And there's an evolutionary reason for the development of gender in animals, which creates a much more stable, multi-celled organisms, actually, and at the same time makes sure that there's enough genetic, mix to prevent inbreeding.
Yeah, enough
right?
diversity.
So it both a stabilizing and a diversifying force that creates the preconditions for development as well as stability. But that binary is a real binary from the real world. It's not something that we created in our language. Now, it is true that in the culture, most culture, men and women are seen as unequal, right? Unequal. Men are seen as more worth than women. That's not from our language. That is the real conditions that's been created in the real world between men and women. Women are, as a general rule, more oppressed than men for historical reasons that we briefly touched upon before. This has nothing to do with the way that we signify them. And that's again, we go back to this idea that, we just need to change our language. But binary oppositions exist in the real world. Nature is full of contradictions, and that is reflected in the language that we use. And our language is a reflection of the nature that we experience and that we engage with. That's where the language comes from.
That's right. What Derrida would argue, I suppose, is that those binary oppositions don't exist in reality. I mean, he kind of denies objective reality because he says that nothing exists outside of the text, i.e. nothing exists outside of the way that we describe the world.
Exactly.
But therefore, he argues, we have total freedom to just reconstruct our reality by deconstructing the binaries that we've created by choice, presumably. Or by habit, maybe.
Yeah.
Go on.
Well, that's the thing. Now we get to the original question you asked, the question of difference, because this is a big one that goes through all of postmodern thinking, which is this idea that there's no general recurring patterns. Whatever patterns are there is just something that we made up. Like you say, there's nothing outside of the text. Reality, there's no objective reality. It's just how we define reality, and whatever is there is infinitely different. So this is the thing that it's funny because I was reading Hegel recently, and this is a objection that was brought to Hegel even during his time about the philosophy of identity. What is identity? When we say, in philosophy, when we talk about identity, is things that are similar to one another can be put in the same category, right? Men, there's no two men who are alike or two women, but we have categories for men and women, which kind of roughly sums up what we know to be from experience to be men and women.
Yeah, the common features.
But what the postmodernists say is, we got you. You see, look at all the men out there. Look at the two of us. We got George here sitting as our technician. 3 men, and don't look anything alike. None of our
I don't know what you mean. Sorry.
None of us. Well, first of all, you have hair, so far at least, and I don't.
Yeah, a bit more of reading this, and we'll see how much is left.
You see, they think they discovered something really, really profound. Everything is different. Everything is different. There's no identity. And Hegel makes the point. He said this is a crude version of looking at his theory, because what we as Marxists understand is that, yes, everything isn't different. If everything is different, everything is in constant state of flux and coming into being, passing away. Nothing is stable in that sense. And yet, in this extremely varied world that we live in, we do see similar patterns recur. And we can understand those patterns, and we can define those patterns, and we can understand the governing principles of those patterns. And that's what, when we talk about mankind or whatever we try to, or an animal or a fruit or whatever, no, there is actually an underlying, an underlying governing principle in those things that we can figure out, and that we can that we can learn to understand by investigating those things. That doesn't mean that every single man is the same or every single woman is the same. No, they're not. It's precisely the opposite. But in this extremely varied universe, we do see recurring patterns. So the philosophy of Marxism includes both identity and difference. But the philosophy of postmodernism has only difference. Everything is just different. But what is pure difference? It's nothing. It's just one. In reality, if it's pure difference, then everything is the same, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
It's just one undifferentiated block of difference.
Yeah, it's like entropy almost. It's like the heat death of the universe. It's just
exactly
everything is just of equal truth, equal worth, equal correctness, equul falseness. It's without content.
It's completely without. Pure difference is pure nothing. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. It's just one homogeneous block of nothing. Right? And that is a much more dead and unnuanced reality. Whereas the Marxist and Hegelian reality, or form of viewing reality, sees the world as a incredibly varied, nuanced world in constant upheaval, constant coming into being and passing away. And yes, with fundamental patterns recurring at higher and higher levels of complexity. Now, we form this question of language. This touches the question, well, what is our words then? What are our words then? Is our words that particular, when I say man, is it man? It's not. But it is an approximation to that governing recurring pattern that exists within the phenomena that we know as men. And throughout human history, we refine and deepen our understanding of that particular pattern. So in that sense, the definition of a man or a dog or an apple or whatever is truer, is deeper than any individual apple that we can see. It doesn't mean that that's not a beautiful apple and it doesn't taste good, but it's a deeper form of truth, because it looks at certain relationships which are not immediately visible to the brain, to the eye. Sorry, and I think that's the difference. You see, the ability to make universals is a human ability. Although some animals can do it, some animals can generalize in a very rudimentary way.
Yeah, like an animal that is a prey animal has to be able to generally recognize what's safe to chase and what isn't.
Exactly. And some animals can go a little bit further, even learn things, crows or chimpanzees and stuff like that. But what distinguishes our ability is that we can actually, in our mind, we take that immediate thing that's right there in front of us, and then we can actually look at the abstract relations which causes it. There's there are relations in this world that we can't see or touch, but they are there as a result of the real objective world. They are real objective relations. Mm-hmm. But there's no matter to them. You can't touch them. But they are the ones that create gravity. Is a relationship between two bodies of mass. Maybe some physicist out there is gonna correct me, but there are laws of development which you can't touch, but which are equally objective, and that is precisely what lies at the basis of what we call universals, of our general conceptions, and that is what language is the ability to pass on those general conceptions. Any word that you use. You can never describe, Hegel makes the point, you can never describe what's immediately there, because you're just going to be saying universals. This man is here. This is a universal. It can apply to anything that's in front of any person, right?
Yep.
Is a universal of being, of existence, of being in the world. And here again is something that implies a relation to whoever is saying it, right?
Mhm.
So all of the words that we use are universals, but those universals correspond to real relations, to real patterns that occur in our world and that we, through our experience, have learned and understood.
Yeah, and by understanding them, we're able to affect them in ways that are useful. We turn the thing in itself into a thing for us.
Yeah.
We take something like fire, and we learn sometimes through painful experience about the general principle that it's hot, but we also learn that it can be useful. And then we can apply that knowledge with all subsequent instances of fire in order to help us cook, in order to help us build combustion engines, in order to help us build society and civilization. Something else I wanted to talk about, not in relation to any one of these people, but kind of common across all of them. On the one hand, they put a lot of emphasis on sort of thinking differently and deconstructing systems of thought and systems of language and this sort of thing. But they kind of treat language and the way that we describe and think about the world as almost a negative thing, almost something which exclusively divides us, something which is a barrier between ourselves and others and ourselves and the world. But is that true? Is the mind always a barrier or an obstacle to the world?
Yes, well, postmodernism is a branch of subjectivism, of subjective idealism, which is the strain and philosophy which raises the subjective individual point of view, the one-sided particular kind of point of view, above the objective. So there's no objective world and objective lawfulness beyond the subjective. That's basically what these people are saying. And that means elevating the mind and the individual mind at that, or the limited mind, not mind as such, to a definer of the world, something that defines the world, but also, as you say, something that separates us from the real world. You know, the idea that, well, everyone is partial, everyone is biased, and therefore you can never get to an objective truth. 2 + 2 is 4 for you and for me, but maybe not for the next person who comes around. You know, and who are we to say that's wrong? That's not objective truth. Even though I think if you want to go to space and you want to use math, that is still the math you're going to use, because that's the only one that's going to get you anywhere. Because it is an objective truth. It's an absolute objective truth. Doesn't mean there's not more to be said about maths and about the world.
Yeah, I mean, even that very basic premise, technically, in very large expressions of 2, like 2.4, if you put 2.4 and 2.4, you get 4.8, which is closer to 5. But that doesn't break the general principle.
Precisely. That just goes to prove it and deepen our understanding of that. But I think there is a mystification of the question of the mind. And there is it's almost a religious way, you know, of mystifying what is the mind, where does it come from? In the old days, you should look at the pineal gland for where consciousness comes from. But modern science has really illuminated all of this stuff. First of all, you see, life arose as single-celled organisms that just replicated itself. And since then, what has been the primary impulse of life? It's been adaptability and self-preservation. Self-preservation comes to the better ability to adapt to new conditions and to changing conditions. That is the basis of life on this planet. But then about 3.5 billion years ago, these very, proto-life cells started developing sensitivities. They could detect certain chemicals, and they could respond to them by some random mechanical reaction, either, contract or the opposite, expand, right? And you saw these kind of cell membranes which had like some sort of channels in them, which could detect these chemicals, and they could trigger a binary response, by the way. And that was the early stages, not of the mind, but of, how do you say, adaptability and of reflexes in organisms. Now that obviously developed. You saw other sensitive cells. You saw the specialization of certain cells to be photosensitive, some starting to be pressure sensitive in multicellular organisms. And then around 600 million years ago, you saw the development of what's called the nerve net, which is animals which they don't have a central processing like you have in jellyfish. You have a nerve net. There's no central nervous system, but there is a nerve net of kind of semi-connected cells and nerves and muscles and whatever ligaments that can contract and expand and kind of push you in certain directions. But then again, around 550 million years ago, and I have to say I'm not a biologist, so if there's any biologists out there who's gonna correct me, please go ahead. That would be very, very helpful. During the Cambrian explosion, we saw the birth of the brain and the head. Basically, animals starting to move in a certain direction, and that made it preferable for their sensors, such as smell and taste and photosensitive eyes and so on, photosensitive cells to be placed in one area, in the area of movement, basically. Mm-hmm. So you saw the collection of nerves in clusters at what then came to be the front of the animals. Then fast forward again a few million years, you saw the rise of vertebrates, which added a spine that collected the central nervous system, all of the central nerves throughout the body, and integrated a lot of these nerves even further and integrated them with the basic functions of movement and development and all sorts of internal functions. You saw the development of basic instincts, basic rituals. All of these things were what? They were ways that animals and life adapted to the conditions. Mm-hmm. And the more complex this adaptation and this, from just sensing a chemical and then moving away from it or moving towards it, they became more able to adapt, more able to distinguish and differentiate between which areas what to go towards and what to move, and they could survive in more varied conditions. They could adapt in more varied conditions. They became more, malleable, became more flexible. You also saw rudimentary emotions develop, like fear, hunger, lust. They all play an evolutionary role in, fear, obviously moving us away from danger, hunger, moving us getting us to go for food, lust, getting us to procreate. And that developed further. You saw 150 million years ago, the limbic system developing in lower mammals, the development of memory, the development of more complex emotions, which could be linked to memory. You can say, oh, I've seen this before. I'm going to be afraid of this, or I'm going to like this, and I'm going to try to achieve this.
I saw that thing eat one of my friends, so I know it's dangerous. I'm sad about that, and I'm scared of that, so I'm going to not go near it in the future.
Precisely. Later on, you saw the development of more complex emotions like bonding, empathy, shame. When was that? That was because animals started developing, in particular mammals, herd and pack forms of lives, which again created more stable, more adaptable organisms and better conditions for survival. Mm-hmm. And the animals beginning to develop social relations with one another. And you saw then further on, around the same time, you saw the development of the neocortex, the ability of animals to simulate future events. If lions want to hunt, or wolves want to hunt, they hunt in packs. That requires certain planning. That requires certain thinking ahead. And then again, 14 million years ago, prefrontal cortex, which really develops this even more. We see impulse control, delayed gratification, the theory of the mind, the idea that I exist and I am different from every other the other thing. And obviously then you had humanity developing, which really raised this to a new level with a very advanced development of the prefrontal cortex than apes and so on. And language centers, which meant what? Which meant that we can share our experiences. We can abstract things. We can abstract things from our experiences. We can draw general conclusions. And then we can pass on this knowledge. And that then raises the question, what is the mind? It is, and the way I see it, it's a regulatory function for our species. It's what regulates, first of all, our, internal biological systems, the heart and all of these things. It regulates us as individuals in our relation to others, but it also regulates our society and our species as a society. We're one organism, and the mind is how to say, the mind is not just relegated. Our ideas and our knowledge is not just reduced to us. It's something that's been developing throughout the history of humankind, and it's every generation passing on their knowledge. We are sitting here as followers of Karl Marx. Karl Marx developed ideas based on the whole prehistory of humanity before him, and other people like that. Aristotle, a peak of human society at a certain period of development, which then generalized a huge amount of all of that experience into very, very important ideas that then later people like Hegel, like Marx, and others built on. So that means the mind is not just a regulatory function for us as individuals, but us as a species, allowing us to understand nature at deeper and deeper levels and adapt to it. And basically, that is the you can say the evolutionary function of the mind. Obviously, once that's developed, it's not, we don't use our brains just to survive, just to stay alive. But obviously, as advanced species, suddenly we can actually do things even for the fun of it, enjoying things. We can actually manipulate our emotions and reach higher forms of passion that no other animals had. Although the development of passion and emotions and the rational mind are evolutionary developments, but they serve different purposes for us. And they allow us to raise ourselves above, if the conditions are right, above this barbaric struggle for survival. And so once you see it in that way, the mind is demystified.
Yes.
And it's a bridge. It's a way for us to understand nature, of harmonize with it even more, to adapt to it, and to adapt it to our needs. And through doing that, also changing ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that I find really depressing about the postmodern outlook. This extreme subjectivity that restricts your truth to that alone, cuts you off not just from the accumulated experience and knowledge of everyone around you, of the whole of society, but also the whole of history. This incredible wealth of knowledge and information and experience that we've used to build civilization and will eventually use to build socialism, to build a better form of civilization. And the postmodernist just retreats from reality like they burn their hands on a hot stove and exist only, they like to think, I mean, not really, but that's what they claim, within the confines of their own subjectivity. It's an extremely narrow, cynical, and self-defeating way of looking at the world.
Yeah. Well, what I explained here, that is a path of progress of life. By the way, an interesting thing is intelligence and emotions has developed several times throughout the tree of life, you can say,
Yes, yeah.
independently.
Yeah, convergently, it's true, yeah.
It's not just human beings, but you have intelligence in some birds,
Yeah.
crows.
And totally different. I mean, the anatomy of a bird's brain is very different to that of a mammal's, but it produces results that have some common features.
Yeah. and octopuses, and they also have octopuses also have certain emotions that we don't quite understand, but they do. They can be frustrated, they can be jealous, they can be
and they have a
spiteful,
and they have a distributed nervous system, like you were saying earlier. But
so, but it goes to show that it's a natural, if unimpeded, life naturally gravitates towards that, right? There's a logic to it, and it's not just we're not special beings, for having that. But what is then the progress? The path of progress is higher and higher mastery over nature, and mastery over our destinies. That's what the postmodernists, disavow.
Yeah, that's what they have incredulity towards.
Yeah, there's no such thing as progress, because all progress has come with bad things.
Yeah,
and it's true, but again, they only see one side of things. That's the if you want to reduce postmodernism to one thing, it's the highest. Let's use some of the. It's the most absolute form of one-sidedness.
Yeah.
Which is, advances in human history has come through class society. Humanity was, in its early days, was a communistic animal. It didn't have properties. It didn't have social hierarchies as we know them, class hierarchies. If there was any hierarchy, it was for practical reasons. People who are particularly good at certain things would lead the clan and the tribe and so on for limited periods of time. But there wasn't a real social difference between these. There was a division of labor between the sexes, men and women, but there wasn't the inequality that we know from class society today. But obviously that was a very, very primitive form of society. There were no kings, there were no capitalists, there were no owners of anything. Everyone was a collective effort to survive and to move forward. But there was also a very barbaric and very brutal form of existence. Now, with the development of agriculture, we've described this many other places, but with the development of agriculture and different techniques, you saw mankind for the first time beginning to develop, to produce enough surplus for some people not having to work their asses off, basically, right? Which means that surplus product was suddenly the object of competition in society. It just so happens that was created in the domain of the men, which for particular reasons dominated agriculture and so on. So women were reduced from that. There was the creation of private property, which men wanted to pass on to their offspring. There was a need to protect that private property, pass it on to your offspring, which meant that you needed to guard. You need to assert your dominance over the woman and guard them from sleeping with anyone else, so that you could prove who was the real father of who your real children are, and through that, women's oppression was created. And through that, class society was created. And through that, through that process, you begin to see the rise of, oppressor classes, exploiting classes who lived off of the labor of the rest of society, of the exploitation of the rest of society. That was obviously, that brought a lot of that had a lot of very disastrous consequences.
A lot of suffering.
A lot of suffering for the majority of human. But at the same time, it also allowed certain layer of the population not to work, and therefore being able to think and study and dedicate their lives to developing the arts and sciences and philosophy and technique. And through that, we saw also the other side of it, which is the real progress, the real gain of humanity from this process, from this incredibly painful process, is all of this vast knowledge and art and culture which is created for us through this process. And yes, every step of this, from the slave society to feudalism, to capitalism. There's been untold of brutality. I mean, capitalism, Foucault lists all of the crimes of capitalism, especially capitalist, a lot of the early days of capitalist science, not even the early days, even more recent ones, when it comes to psychiatry, for example, how it's been used and abused by the ruling class. Yes, science has been abused by the ruling class in many ways and has been used to oppress and repress. But that doesn't mean that it's reactionary by its very nature. That science in itself, that science and technique that the whole history of class struggle has created, now lays in front of humanity a golden opportunity to completely liberate itself from all of class society, precisely by using technique to raise living standards. You can get rid of classes and you can create a harmonious development for all of humanity into the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to round off this discussion, which has been really interesting and far-reaching, it's almost like you can have a better discussion by railing against these people and illustrating what we actually stand for than any meaning they provide on their own. I can imagine some people listening to this and thinking, well, okay, I guess you have objections to this particular philosophical outlook, but isn't it just essentially at worst harmless nonsense? I mean, why does it matter that these people think these things? And the answer to that is, well, first of all, it's not as though the ideological struggle has no value. It does. It's one of the fields of class struggle, actually. But there are practical consequences that result from the application of these ideas. And while you don't hear many people on the street or in wider society talking about Foucault and Derrida necessarily, the basic premise of postmodernism finds its way into ideas that are used in a reactionary way in the class struggle, that do impact the left, that do impact the labour movement. I mean, Foucault was literally utilized by the CIA to undermine communist circles at universities in the 80s. Yes, he was. Look it up. But the ideas of identity politics, which are very widespread and widespread in the labour movement and the left, are related to postmodernism. They're an offshoot of postmodernism. It's a subjectivist philosophy that personal experience and your identity and the cross sections of identity is what defines your experience of oppression and struggle, and that the oppression of women and black people and gay people and trans people and so on is just on the same level as the class struggle. It's just one of a rainbow of different forms of oppression, and they all have to be equally recognized, and only individuals can define their experience of oppression and get to say what's oppressive and what isn't. And that's a very popular idea on the left. The reformists use this a lot, the liberals refer to this a lot, and the ruling class uses it all the time, and their mouthpieces use it all the time. In relation to the Palestine movement, for example, the allegation that comes from the Zionists and the bourgeois media that the movement in solidarity with Palestine is inherently anti-Semitic. One of the arguments the Zionists use, which gets parroted basically by all the mouthpieces of the ruling class, is, well, Jews, by which they mean these particular Zionist Jews, think that if you oppose the actions of the State of Israel, and if you say that the founding of Israel was reactionary, they regard that as anti-Semitic, and because they're Jewish, they define their oppression, so you have to accept that it's anti-Semitic. So if you support the Palestinian struggle, if you support the Palestinians or the idea of Palestinian liberation, that means that you're being anti-Semitic. You're disregarding the lived experience of Jewish people. That's identity politics. That is literally identity politics. But it goes the other way as well. You see it within the left. You see it coming out of, actually, some of the so-called or self-described official organizations of the Palestinian liberation movement. And I had an example I wanted to draw on. So during the student occupation movement that occurred, was it a year ago now? Year and a half ago, our Canadian comrades put out a call for a nationwide student strike for Palestine all across the country. And it was a really popular idea. It had a lot of grassroots support from student populations at different universities, and an organization called the Palestine Youth Movement, which declared itself I don't know under what authority, but declared itself to be the representative, the official representative of the student Palestine liberation movements, refused to engage with this idea of a nationwide student strike. And then at a national student meeting, one of their representatives turned up, voted against the idea of a strike, and said that the PYM would oppose the idea of a strike because the people arguing for it were not Palestinian. And so they were taking up space from Palestinian activists, and they were decentering Palestinian voices. So they literally attacked the idea of a unified struggle, a unified class struggle, using class struggle methods for Palestine in order to oppose the universities investing in and associating with the Israeli war machine, basically. They were to undermine that unified struggle on the basis of essentially identity politics. But the comrades tell me, they say what should be done is dialogue with and putting pressure on the Liberal Party, which is a reactionary, bourgeois, Zionist party in Canada, to try and pressure them into supporting an arms embargo. So this logic of talking with or supporting or discussing with non-Palestinians was applied very selectively. It was applied exclusively, it seems, to communists, to Marxists, to people using class struggle methods, but they were perfectly happy to engage with a Zionist bourgeois party. So this is a concrete example of how these ideas play a divisive and poisonous idea in the left. It's not just an intellectual matter.
Yes, and I mean, there's a lot to. I mean, this is a good example, but this stuff happens all the time. First of all, the idea that the correctness of your ideas is determined by your race. That's the word that the imperialists use, right? The reactionaries. Your ethnicity. You would think that's normally a ruling class idea.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, that's the idea that these guys are putting forward here. You cannot talk. Your words don't have any impact, or how to say, meaning, or importance, or value, because of your ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's something we hear all the time. Why would you, I mean, I guess I'm not a white person, but why are you guys white people going to tell the Middle Eastern people about Marxism and the Middle East? They kind of raise the prejudice, the racist prejudice, to a principle. They just turn it around. They say, oh no, it's not white people who are good, but it's colored people or whoever they're kind of supposedly defending. So in that way, there's no they actually don't change things. They actually latch on to the same reactionary ideas. Now, the question of Palestine is an objective question. What is the main cause of the oppression of the Palestinian people, if not Western imperialism and Western capitalism? What has caused all of the main tragedies which had befallen on the peoples of the Middle East since the peak of the Ottoman Empire? Right? It's been capitalism, British imperialism. Once British imperialism rose, they maintained the Ottoman Empire there as the main oppressor of the peoples of the Middle East because it fit their strategic interests. And after World War II, they started taking up, dominating directly that area themselves. Then after that, American imperialism took over. Then they founded the State of Israel and supported its development, the Zionist state, because of their own narrow capitalist reasons. And on that basis, they held back the development of all of these countries: Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. Although these were artificial entities created by the imperialists themselves. But nevertheless, every movement towards modernization, towards development, towards raising themselves up from backwardness was stopped by the imperialists. right? And so that is the main enemy of the Palestinian working class and the Palestinian masses. That is U.S. imperialism, Western imperialism, and Israeli imperialism. Surely, therefore, the best way to fight against that is precisely to fight that ruling class in the West. And by linking that struggle with the class struggle in the West. And that struggle is directly linked. The same people who are attacking working class people in the West, in Canada, in Britain, in the US, are the ones who are attacking, who are supporting the state of Israel that's attacking the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
Surely a unified class struggle is the only way forward. But what do these guys do? They do everything they can to move away from a class struggle, to reduce the question to a purely national question of the Palestinian masses. And we are in full support of the Palestinian masses. We defend the right of the Palestinian masses to decide their own destiny and their own future. But we also say, this is our opinion, the struggle for Palestinian liberation is directly linked with the struggle against the ruling classes in the West.
Yes.
There's no difference between them. And therefore, when you oppose that, when you come out and say, no, this is not about the class struggle, this is not about the Canadian working class, it's not about the American working class, this is only about Palestine, and we want to stick it to that, you're actually impeding that struggle. Mm-hmm. You're actually holding back that struggle. And you're perpetuating the rule of that ruling class. And then not only that, you go and you say, well, no, we should actually dialogue with the liberals. So you acknowledge that the rule of the liberals as a representative of that ruling class, you perpetuate that system.
Yeah, you acknowledge the status quo. You essentially enforce the status quo.
Exactly. And that's the point about identity politics. I've heard a lot of people say, well, why can't, it's just a form of resistance. Why can't it just coexist with Marxism? Because they're mutually exclusive. Marxism calls for the unification of all oppressed peoples and layers in society with the working class in one army against the ruling class, the capitalist class which dominates society. That is the only way to overcome the problems and the contradictions of the capitalist system, mm-hmm. to take over the means of production and to use them for the raising of the living standards, and thereby also the gradual dissolving of class contradictions, which will then allow us to get rid of all of these oppressions, mm-hmm. right? These people say, no, class struggle is just one. Our struggle, so-called, is more important. The women's struggle is more important. The Palestinian struggle is more important. The whatever liberation struggle is more important. Or is equally important, and therefore the class struggle shouldn't take the lead.
Or even, you, white male working class, are my enemy, so you can't support me in this struggle, whether you want to or not.
Exactly. And who does that serve? That goes right. That is precisely perpetuating the policy of the ruling class, which has created these myths as a way of supporting its own rule. It reminds me, I brought a quote today. It's one of my favorite quotes. I feel like I've quoted this a few times, but for those of you who've heard it, repetition is the mother of all learning. But Spinoza is a fantastic philosopher, amazing philosopher. He talked about religion and the role of religion, but really what he talked about was the role of ideology in the class struggle. Mm-hmm. He says, it may indeed be the highest secret of monarchical government and utterly essential to it, to keep men deceived and to disguise the fear that sways them with the specious name of religion, so that they will fight for their servitude as if they were fighting for their own deliverance, and not think it humiliating but supremely glorious to spill their blood and sacrifice their lives for the glorification of a single man. Now, this language might seem a bit old-fashioned, but that's because it is old. It's not overly complicated.
No, it's 100,000 times clearer than anything that these modern so-called philosophers we've been talking about.
He says this is the role. He's talking about religion, but you can apply this to the ideological struggle in capitalism today, in all class struggle. said that every ruling class essentially needs an ideology. At that time, in Spinoza's time, it was religion that was used, but every ruling class needs an ideology, a justification for its own existence, and it mobilizes people on the basis of that ideology. But what is paradoxical is that it mobilizes, you can just imagine all of these people who went to the Crusades or,
Yes, yeah.
who fought for the in the name of the Catholic Church and gave their lives to it. Whereas that struggle was for the perpetuation of the rule of the feudal ruling class and the Catholic Church back then. So those people would find it, as what does it say? That they were fighting for their own servitude.
Yes.
They're fighting for their own enslavement, but they thought they were fighting for their own deliverance. And for them, it wasn't humiliating, but a great honor to spill their blood for the glorification of a single man. And here you have, this is what the postmodernism and its derivatives do. They make they sound radical, which means that they get under the skin of a lot of young people who are looking for a way out of the impasse of society have brought us into. But in reality, it drives them down safe channels, which actually perpetuates the divisions that that the ruling class has created to perpetuate its rule. And therefore, they're fighting essentially for the maintenance of this system, and they see that as a huge something to be proud of. And that's the role that these ideas play.
Yeah, and that is absolutely in contradiction to everything that we stand for as Marxists, as communists. We stand for progress, we stand for the liberation of humanity, and we stand for the greatest possible unity of all layers of the working class to overthrow this rotten system that maintains humanity in this state of division and ignorance in order to lay the basis for the development of a new and better society.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing?
Of course you can.
It's just another thing that's very, very symptomatic of these ideas is an extreme form of cynicism and pessimism and despair. Lyotard, the godfather of postmodernism, if you may, he, in the text that you quoted from, he also talks about capitalism and Marxism. I don't know if I should read out this quote, but basically he says, yes, we see that capitalism has contradictions, but we don't think that these contradictions will lead. We no longer expect salvation to rise from these inconsistencies as Marx did. That's what he says. And this is such a despair. It's a view of the world that looks at all of the barbarism and all of the oppression and exploitation that's going on, and despairs.
Yeah.
Because it says nothing can be done. Nothing good will come out of it. The working class will not rise. And if they do, it's just going to be another form of oppression. It's going to be another form of power. It's just despairing. It's a philosophy of despair, really. And it perpetuates that despair by refusing to understand what's going on. And I was thinking about this yesterday, that as Marxists, I think a lot of people wonder, why are you so optimistic? Why are you so jolly, almost, in a situation where the world is falling apart? And why are you not sad and crying and weeping all the time? And it's because that meant, it doesn't, we're human beings. We also have, we have problems like everyone else. I have loads of them I can list out for you, but there is also an individual mental strength that comes from what? From understanding, from looking at this world, yes, seeing all of this horrific stuff going on. What's going on in Palestine? What's all the day suffering that human beings have to endure? But we understand where they're coming from, and we understand how they can be overcome. And that understanding, it actually gives us a huge amount of mental strength to fight on and to overcome. We don't see it We don't see the world as something to be crushed under, but we see the problems of this world as something that's posed to us to overcome. And we are in knowing that and in understanding the historical process which has brought us here. We also are fully confident in the ability of the working class to actually overcome this. This is summed up by a quote by Hegel, actually, which is incredibly profound. He says, "The ignorant man is not free because what confronts him is an alien world, something outside of him." The postmodernists say is something inside of him. Something outside of him and in the offing, on which he depends, without his having made this foreign world for himself, and therefore without being at home in it by himself as in something his own. The impulse of curiosity, the pressure for knowledge from the lowest level to the highest rung of philosophical insight, arises only from the struggle to cancel this situation of unfreedom and to make the world one's own in one's ideas and thought.
Mm-hmm. Well, if postmodernism is the road to despair, then, as Hamid explained, Marxism and mastering the ideas of Marxism and the insight and explanation that you get from looking at the world using the Marxist method and understanding history via the Marxist method can give you that mental strength and give you that fortitude and give you that confidence in the future. And hopefully this podcast has gone some way to providing a little dose of that. And of course, all of the reading in the description and all the previous episodes and the material on our website will deepen that feeling and that confidence even more. Hamid, thank you so much. That was excellent.
Thank you very much, Joe.
That was our 50th episode of the Spectre of Communism overall, by my counts. And it's also the penultimate episode of this season. So we'll be back one last time in 2025 for another episode of the Spectre of Communism before we go on our winter break. I'll see you then. And thank you so much for tuning in.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communists. The communists. The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.